Today we're going to be starting with the first session with three speakers. First, we have Michelle Wong, who currently adjunct teaches at the University of Hong Kong, where she received her PhD recently. Her dissertation project is a monographic study of the late Hong Kong artist Ha Bik-chuen and explores the cultural modernity and artistic modernism emerging from post-World War II Hong Kong. Previously, Michelle was a researcher at Asia Art Archive, focusing on Hong Kong art history and histories of exchange and circulation through exhibitions and periodicals. She has also curated exhibitions with many institutions. Following Michelle, we have Priya Jaradi, who is convener for art history, a collaboration between National University of Singapore and US, the National Gallery Singapore, and the Singapore Art Museum. Between 2005 and 2007, Jardi served as assistant curator, focusing on South Asia at the Asian Civilizations Museum. She's the author of many books, but for her recent publication titled Transcultural Imaginations revisits the 1959 donation from the government of India to Malaya. And I believe she's going to be talking about this during her presentation. Lastly, we have Sue, who convened this research project with Yomi. He's a curator and art history researcher based in Beijing and has devoted recent years to reinterpreting and radical imagination of the history of China's contemporary art. He was senior curator at the Beijing Inside Out Art Museum from 2017 to 2020 and served as a research fellow at Tsinghua University Art Museum from 21 to 24. He has recently initiated an ongoing research project that re-explores the individual cases of art practice in China post-1949 and thinking it through the lens of contemporaneous perspective. So without further ado, we invite Michelle.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Michelle. I just wanted to say a few thank yous before I start. I want to thank Yomi and Sue for inviting me on this journey. So I'm actually speaking about something that's not related to my recently completed dissertation project, which is a relief and great. And I also wanted to thank the Documenta Institute and the Goethe Institute for hosting all of this. So what I will be presenting on today is some working notes and thoughts on how curatorial framing of our current time shapes our understanding of Cold War cultural production, coming from beyond the North Atlantic, in particular from East and Southeast Asia. Specifically, I'm looking at art forms that have an affinity to a certain kind of visual language of abstraction. These works are often made during the Cold War period and are associated with the aesthetic, attitude, and the medium of ink. These works were often shown during the time when they were made, and they've gained more visibility under the category of ink art since 2000s, with exhibitions and collection acquisitions by museums in the region of Asia, especially in M+ in Hong Kong and in National Gallery in Singapore. And this paper is developed from the Hanoi workshop, which was in November 2024, which I participated in which I took a more historicist approach to look at the development of ink art. David Tay, who is present at Hanoi but not here today, sort of prompted me to think that these categories were in fact driven by curatorial impulses from institutions. And I sort of thought about it, and this is sort of how this current presentation is going. And so what I'm trying to sort of think through is behind these impulses were a desire for a certain kind of modernism, which was non-Western, errant, and not Euro-American centric and focused on the North Atlantic. The shows that I will walk you through in a few moments remain some of the most visible platforms for art that end up shaping our own understanding of Cold War cultural production. I'm hoping to demonstrate that the categories as ink art are formed due to a desire from the contemporary or current time, but the question I'm really interested in asking, and perhaps to provide some preliminary answer, is this: why has ink art lent itself to this very framing? And one of the reasons that I am going to propose is that ink art, or works that fall under this category, has a close association with artistic modernism, that it rejects a traditional representation, that their makers have an awareness of the self or have made self-conscious creative decisions that in turn reflect their own subjecthood. And in those works and in those creative decisions were an aspiration for something universal or utopian. I will get to images eventually. There will be art. The visual language of abstraction akin to gestural expressionist, which is also often seen as the dichotomy to representation, becomes a useful one. I am not denying that this visual language in artists of Chinese descent aligned with Cold War narrative and actual conditions. And we've seen from presentation yesterday that there is this relationship. And indeed, many of them receive direct and indirect support from the CIA or the JDR Rockefeller grants. And Leslie Ma's essay, The New Chinese Landscape in the Cold War Era, published in this volume by Liu Jie and Midori Yamamura, Visual Representations of the Cold War and Post-Colonial Struggles, Art in East and Southeast Asia, discusses one such instance in which curatorial framing impacts the reception of cultural production during the Cold War era. The show that Leslie focuses on was titled The New Chinese Landscape, 6 Contemporary Chinese Artists. It toured around the US in 1968 with sponsorship from the JDR Third Fund, which was managed by the American Federation for the Arts, and thus did not involve any government agency in its organization. The show featured 60 works by mainland-born artists living in Taiwan and the US. Amongst them were artists like Liu Guosong, Zhuang Zhe, and Feng Zhongrui, who were painters of the modernist group, the Fifth Moon. And these artists adopted a visual language that was inspired by American and European abstraction, creating gestural strokes through both brushwork, ink and color washes, and the addition paper collage, like here in Zhuang Zhe's case, and in Liu Guosong's case, the removal of paper fiber. The paper actually he made himself. And this is an installation view from one part of the exhibition. One of the works that Liu Guosong showed was titled Early Spring. There. And it's the third hanging scroll from the left in the vitrine. Liu Guosong titled his work as a deliberate reference to the Northern Song painter Guo Xi's Early Spring, in which the central monumental mountain represented not only the sublime awesomeness of nature, but could also be read as the stability that a good emperor brings on in his reign. So this is like, if you were to study Asian art history, this is one of the works that you have to look at. Yes, traditional Chinese paintings, especially of landscapes, has its own lineage and visual language of non-representation, such as the 3 distances, the high distance Gaoyuan, deep distance Shenyuan, and level distance in Pingyuan. Abstraction was therefore a conceptual exercise rather than a rejection or a move away from representation. Liu Guosong and his Fifth Moon group friends, their choice of working with landscape and Liu Guosong's naming of his own work after one of the canonical works in Chinese art history was what I think not a rejection of the tradition of representation, but rather a renewal of a tradition of non-representation. The artist's visual language of abstraction and the framing of the exhibition served as a way of connecting themselves to the tradition of Chinese paintings while increasing their appeal to a non-Chinese, and in this case, American audience. And from sort of yesterday's presentation, I sort of added some of these slides. The same group of artists who were showing in 1968 in Washington were also having shows in Hong Kong. So this is one of their exhibitions in a artist-run but commercial gallery, Sally Jackson Art Gallery. So this is 1967 of their show. And the owner of this gallery, called Jackson Yu, himself was an artist who made abstract work and was showing in Marcos's Philippines during the 60s. And there were multiple artists from Hong Kong who was doing that. These shows did not get framed under the Cold War framework at the time, especially in the places where they were showing. But as you can see here, the Philippine critics' harsh words on Jackson Yu's work did reveal how the Philippine audience expected somewhat what Chinese painting should look like versus how abstract works should look like. These exhibitions in History of Exchange offers, I would propose, a different constellation of the international that is different from the Cold War binary, as well as the non-aligned alliance. The appeal of non-West modernism in work shown in the New Chinese Landscape, as well as the cosmopolitanism they contain and embody became a central part of M+'s ink art show in 2017 and 2018, also curated by Leslie Ma. And here you see there is actually Liu Guosong and Zhuang Zhe again in that same combination appearing in those shows. Only that the curatorial framing of the M+ show then sort of moves on to a global abstraction, where then ink is one, you can say, aesthetic attitude. And this is another installation view of the show. This is before M+'s actual museum was open. This is in their pavilion. It should be noted that the works and artists that we've discussed so far, except for Jackson Yu, were all Taiwanese. And the Taiwanese national government, a nationalist government, was an American ally during the Cold War and was the only China recognized by the free world at the time. And we had this discussion over on the timelines yesterday. The 1968 show of the new Chinese landscape, therefore, was inevitably inflected by this Cold War climate, even though the organization of the show itself did not involve any government agency. And another artist show in the 1968 show, Chen Qiquan, who also showed at the New Chinese Landscape, and Liu Guosong himself would find their own works in another show that took place in 2022 at Taipei Fine Arts Museum that Kat and Fang Zi co-curated, called Art Histories of a Forever War, Modernism Between Space and Home. The work 90-Degree Curves depicts Chen's memory of a flight, and I'm reading from their catalog now, of a flight during his military service in 1944. This 2-meter-long painting actualizes an aerostatic vision through classical Chinese painting techniques, and it offers a poetic counterpoint to the scientific visuality represented by the reproductions of NASA photographs and posters displayed in the same gallery, end quote. So the new Chinese landscape curatorial framing in 1968, that Cold War framing may not be so covert, but I find it interesting that artists who were part of this show would still sort of fit under not only curatorial frameworks like ink art in the M+ show, but also, the Cold War climate continues to sort of be renewed as curatorial framing, even in shows in 2022. And another place that these works actively get categorized and collected as ink art is in Singapore, which was established in 1965 as a multicultural nation state. The category of ink art works for states like Singapore kind of works, I would propose, because it aligns with a post-colonial narrative. And it offers a way of framing the artworks by one of its majority ethnicities in a way that highlight aesthetics and cultural heritage. And so the National Gallery of Singapore collects ink art, and in 2018 has a whole series of shows focusing on that. So this is one of Chen Chong-sui. You can see, this is then some of the works that were shown at the time. You can see it still adopts a certain kind of formal aspect of Chinese painting, where it's a long scroll, you read from the bottom up. But there's also sort of a less focus on brushstrokes, in that sense that it kind of also moves away from the traditional, in this case, literati painting. And there's more, and there's even Wu Guanzhong. And more recently, 2023 and 2024, Liu Guosong makes an appearance again, right? And there's the biggest donation of Liu Guosong's work to the National Gallery of Singapore. This is one of the works. What I find researching this, the most interesting show, and this is in 2013, that sort of quite openly talks about ink art and how it fits within the national discourse of Singapore is this one with the National Museum of Singapore called The Changed World. It really talks about how ink art fits or doesn't fit within the national narrative, and the curators really talk about it. One example would be Ye Zhiwei's Dayak Man Love Cockfighting, or just, in some cases, it's just titled Cockfighting, which is a work of oil on canvas. In the sense of medium, it moved away from ink, but has homed in on the cultural symbolic meaning of certain images and motifs that could still be associated with Chinese culture. And these include the use of auricle bone characters, which you see in the top, in the center, to compose what would have been a written inscription. And unlike some artists, for example, in Hong Kong, who work with auricle bones purely as a formal element in their compositions, Ye Zhiwei actually did use the script to write complete sentences. This is another example of how some artists use oracle-born scripts just as a formal element. The curators of the show, Xian Tan and Daniel Pham, recorded and shared discussions in the exhibition's publication, and I quote, Ye's work involves a conscious mingling of and fusion of East and West, and yet at the same time, it does in fact show his experimentation with medium and various formalist concerns. He tries very hard to use oil to bring out the beauty of ink and rubbings to create that feeling of antiquity. And then in another, end quote, and in another paragraph, they say, quote, Ye consciously wanted to distill his understanding of Western abstraction into one that considered and fused together his understanding of the region and his own Chinese identity, to form a unique representation that was markedly different from what would emerge from the West or China, end quote. The curators also asked the question very, very directly, and they asked, why look at Chinese painting and what is its place in Singapore art? To which they answer, the immigrant artists were mainly Chinese who were also skilled in painting in Chinese ink and color besides oil. Chinese painting is not just a medium, but more than that. It is tied closely with its traditions, cultural heritage, and iconography. So we're actually looking at two related questions, they continue, that of subject matter itself and that of the medium used. And this remark was, of course, made sort of specifically to this work, Figure of the Dayak Warrior by Si Heng-to. But what I think these works and passages show so clearly is how the category of ink art, in this case, becomes an umbrella fitting for the self-identification of a post-colonial multicultural nation state, which includes being well-versed in the discourse surrounding modernity and its various forms of cultural production. But at this point of our research and thinking process, I want to refocus our attention to the agency of artists, that their desire to be cosmopolitan and modern sort of drove them, some of them, to apply the visual language of abstraction alongside the aesthetic attitude and medium of ink so that they can be part of a nation, and in some cases to be part of an international art world. And here are some examples. This is a pair of work that I found in the Hong Kong Museum of Art, the one on the left, black and white, and a work that's currently in the Ateneo Art Gallery, so in Manila. And if you look at it, you can see the images are actually identical. So they are made from the same matrix. They're made from the same plate. So, and probably around the same time. And so the argument that I would make with this pair of work is that Zhang Yi, who died in 2019, made the black on white work with sort of a more Chinese audience in mind, and that ended up being acquired by the Hong Kong Museum of Art. And the white on white is actually a gift of Zhang Yi to Zobel, also in the 1960s. Zobel is one of the major modernist painters in the Philippines and Metro Manila, and that ended up being a bequeathment to the Ateneo Art Gallery. When I found these works, I was doing some research in Manila almost 10 years ago, and I was like, the curators at Ateneo said, we have these works by our Hong Kong artists, but we don't know. And I was like, so they brought it out, I was like, oh, I know exactly who made it. And the fact that the same woodblock, I would think, sort of yielded these two images demonstrated the artist's strategic decisions of making certain kinds of work for a certain audience. Many of these artists, including Havikshin and Zheng Yi and Ye Zhiwei and all of the artists that I discussed, had their own entanglements with mainland China, from internal displacement as a result of warfare to immigration out of the mainland to Hong Kong and Malaya, which later became Malaysia and Singapore. And due to circumstances such as a lack of access to resources, and sometimes by choice, artists used mediums other than ink but held on to certain formal aspects and subject matter that maintained a close association with Chinese culture and its painting tradition. And so Havikshin, who's an artist I've worked on for many, many years, visited Huangshan in 1982, which is a cultural and art historically significant site when it comes to Chinese paintings. They started painting it, in the Song dynasty. And there's a certain aspiration ideal with the literati that sort of gets attached with this mountain. And he documented extensively this visit in photography. And it was his first visit to mainland China after leaving in 1949 and eventually settling in Hong Kong via Macau in 1958. I suggest that these works could be read as instances where artists try to locate and negotiate a place for their own projection of a culture China and warrant further studies through this critical framing. And it's something that I'll be continuously working on for book chapters and other exhibitions. And to draw this presentation to a close, but I think then ink art is perhaps a category devised from the contemporary that allows for an interchangeable and overlapping lens of nation state, postcolonialism, cosmopolitanism, and modernism. But what underpins this category and makes it so attractive to these overlapping lenses applied by curatorial institutions is perhaps the artist's individualist trajectories. That some of them invented new visual languages that aligned not only with some formal aspect of artistic modernism, but alongside with its aspirational and sometimes utopic attitude. These creative decisions were often strategic, which in turn highlighted their self-awareness and modern subjecthood, as they were exercising their own agency following their desires. Their works and practices in this case are not so easily flattened to fit one category or another. And let's also not deny the essentializing undertones, however vague and diluted, of ink art. That may not age well as China changes. And the China in 2008 or in 2013 is a very different China from the China in 2018, and especially for me, for someone coming from Hong Kong after 2019. And how do institutions deal with that, and can they actually deal with that? And this also leaves me thinking about ink art as artworks that do artworks that fit under this category be a place for any radical thinking? Or did the artist's desire for cosmopolitanism and modernity, whether it manifested in a modernist visual language that could conform to the visuality of a new nation state, or one that garnered visibility in the international art world, was so ultimately driven by capitalist and individualist ideals that it precluded any room for radical or revolutionary thinking? Or is this, again, a trap of the Cold War discourse? Then, I've circled back to all of that. But after all, I do want to highlight that artists from Hong Kong did show in the Philippines in 1960, and that was Marcos's Philippines. And the first international salon of paintings by the Hong Kong Modern Literature and Art Association held in 1960, which has Liu Wosong, Chen Tingshi, Feng Zhongrui, Li Wanjia, and even Chong Su-pian, right? And there's a Korean artist who I have no idea who that is. That exhibition makes a reference to Documented Two, which, Su-wei mentioned, it's not only just an abstract art documented through, it has a lot more political connotations. So I'm currently still working through this, and how could radical thinking have a place in such practices, or am I asking, again, the wrong question? And again, of course, also I'm thinking through this in relation to that tradition of Black paintings, which in the beginning of CCP, of that China post-1949, was also labeled as degenerate. And ink art had a different history of persecution. So I leave, the question is still open, whether ink art as a visual language, as an art category sort of encompasses visual language or attitude, or it seems to have this versatility to fit multiple sets of discourse. Does it actually offer a way for us to piece all of these complexities together, or how might that work remain something? I think it's too early to tell. And I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
My thanks to the conveners of this symposium, Su-wei and Yumi, also to the Documenta Institute and the Goethe Institute, and a special thanks to Hein and Sophia for the impeccable arrangements around this symposium. Thank you so much. Okay, so abiding by the brief that was presented to me by Su-wei, I will begin this presentation with an overview of the museum landscape in independent India, to be followed up with a case study i.e., a donation of artifacts that was made by the government of India to the University of Malaya Art Museum in 1959. And I will conclude with some reflections on the theoretical frameworks which are brought to bear on this particular case study, but which I also think might have the potential to inform other Southeast Asian exchanges. Right. So I will begin the paper. The profound symbolism of the museum to the new nations of the 20th century in Asia, Africa, and Latin America remains widely known. In the late Professor Kavita Singh's words, museums were conceived as shrines to the national culture, and India was no different. Since its independence in 1947, for 3 straight decades, India's museums gained shape and momentum through 3 pillars and objectives. So first, the museum movement brought all museums in India, whether state or provincial museums, under a united administrative belt. It created a platform for the exchange of ideas and services among museum professionals. And this museum movement also founded an annual journal for the documentation and discussion of museum-related topics. The next pillar constitutes a generation of Indian scholars who would become the leading museum makers of post-independence India, which means that by the mid-20th century, these scholars who were typically trained in ancient history, literature, and culture were equipped to tell the story of 5,000 years of Indian history through its art, objects, and museums, and thus crystallize an official national culture. Now, essentially, this official culture or official telling suggested that artifacts from different regions and epochs within India shared an underlying unity and were thus part of the same glorious Indian civilization. Interestingly, this narrative or this story of 5,000 years of Indian art, which was disseminated via museums, did not simply stop at framing India's or independent India's culture and identity, but it actually also served to engage the region and the world. So this is the focus of today's talk. And this also brings me to the third pillar in the museum landscape post-1947, the museum movement's overseas networks. So I think during the discussion around the timeline yesterday, I did mention briefly that it is no secret, or it was no secret, that independent India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, desired that India serve as an exemplar and a guide to other decolonizing nation states and thus lead a new regional order. This political and diplomatic aspiration was premised significantly on India's civilizational antiquity and cultural achievements. And to this end, India's 5,000-year-old history was presented to Southeast Asian nation states in the form of books, traveling exhibitions, and even artifact donations. So one such artifact donation, which is our case study today, was made by the government of India to the University of Malaya Art Museum in 1959. Now, I do want to clarify that the University of Malaya Art Museum is the predecessor institution of the current National University of Singapore and its museum, right? So this artifact donation was received in Singapore in 1959. And it has been discussed, as Soo-Young mentioned, in a recent publication for which actually Kathleen served as the discussant. So my advance apologies, Kathleen, you're going to have to listen to some of this again. Right, so this donation constituted 55 artifacts and 100 photographs, which included quite a range. Again, a sort of compressed telling of 5,000 years of Indian history through pre- and proto-historic ceramics, classical paintings, Rajput and Mughal manuscript paintings, hand-embroidered textiles from various parts of India, and examples of modern art by the Bombay-based progressive artists M.F. Hussain and H.A. Gade. When this donation arrived in Singapore in 1959, it was announced and presented to the public through press articles and a commemorative exhibition, which was also accompanied by a catalogue. So I do want to emphasize here that no dedicated files have turned up in the archives in Singapore or New Delhi about this donation, which means that essentially the exhibition catalogue and the newspaper reports are really the only records or the primary records of this donation. However, indirect references to the donation emerge in the context of other cultural and educational projects, which we see here on the slide. So without doubt, all these initiatives point towards a climate of state-backed India-Malaya partnerships within which India features as the giver or the donor, whether of books, funds, or of artworks. Consequently, such initiatives between South and Southeast Asia, including the 1959 donation, are typically framed and read in two ways, right? So considering India always features as the giver or the donor, these sorts of exchanges are framed and read through these two lenses. First, as a culturally hegemonic proposition of the Indianization of Southeast Asia, and second, as India's diplomatic gesture in a new regional order. Now, these two views also map on very neatly to the 1959 catalogue's introductory essay, right? So these two views resonate in the catalogue that was produced when the donation was first received in Singapore. And this is how the two views map on, because the introductory essay in the catalogue suggests India's cultural expansion into Southeast Asia as the backdrop and the rationale for the 1959 donation. And second, the catalogue essay also thanks the government of India for the donation, right? So perhaps let's uncover both these views before exploring alternative frameworks through which we could assess the 1959 exchange. So as just mentioned, the 1959 exhibition catalogue suggests India's cultural expansion into Southeast Asia as both the backdrop and the rationale for the donation. And this rationale aligns with the Indianization of Southeast Asia, a theory which was advanced during the Indian independence movement. Indian scholars asserted the notion of an early and a peaceful Indian colonizing migration, which brought its own cultural, political, and religious agendas to Southeast Asia. In summary, the Indianization of Southeast Asia presented India as a mother culture, an origin culture, or even as a bringer of civilization to the rest of Southeast Asia, which came to be called as Greater India. Abiding by this perspective, there is a strong chance that the 1959 donation asserted India's civilizational superiority over Malaya. Consequently, the donation also assumed post-colonial India's dominant position in a new regional order or a new Asian order. For, and as mentioned earlier, Nehru's desire for India to serve as a guide and exemplar to decolonizing nation states drew significantly on his own deep-seated memory of a greater India. And I think this was also raised by Arlit in yesterday's presentation, right? India's culturally hegemonic proposition. So, well, premised on India's political know-how, civilizational antiquity, and cultural achievements, the Greater India theory was brought to bear on contemporary geopolitics and diplomacies. Now, I'd like to pause here to remind us that both these views, the Indianization of Southeast Asia and that of India's diplomatic gesture in a new regional order, represent an Indian state-backed perspective, right? Or the donor or the giver's perspective. Furthermore, both these views are underpinned by a strong geopolitical logic which perpetuates discrete categories of civilization, race, and the nation state. And despite the viability of this geopolitical logic, I ask, how do we read the 1959 donation beyond its obvious nature as an Indian diplomatic gift? Can we entertain the possibility of looking beyond the geopolitical and cartographic fixities of nation states to reassess this donation through a transboundary or a transnational lens? So I suppose, by virtue of its geographic and temporal location, i.e., an India-Malaya exchange which occurs in 1959, this donation can be situated within a wider and a connected landscape of decolonization and third world solidarities, nation building and modernization, and of course, Cold War diplomacies. So, as is widely known, the conclusion of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War marked the end of colonial empires. And throughout the 1950s and 60s, thanks to growing Afro-Asian engagements, such as at the Bandung Conference of 1955, decolonizing and newly independent nation states forged new political, economic, and cultural partnerships to create what we identify as an interconnected global order. So this interconnected order and its networks offered highly imaginative spheres of solidarity for what were otherwise disparate or heterogeneous communities of decolonizing and independent nation states. So perhaps then it becomes feasible to propose that the India-Malaya Museum Partnership too was inspired by the Bandung movement and its ethic of transnational solidarities, one in which Asian and African communities imagined themselves as being connected through a common colonial past and a shared anti-imperial ethic. So to speak to these points of networks, solidarity, and connectedness, one avoids reading the 1959 donation from an exclusively Indian or a Malayan standpoint. Instead, what I'm doing here is to adopt a transcultural approach, or global art history's transcultural approach. So to very quickly to unpack this approach, a transcultural approach is underpinned by the belief that in a highly globalized or an interconnected order, objects and practices cannot be assessed from a fixed cultural or a political standpoint. Instead, we must open up objects, ideas, and even artifact donations to the logic of movement to consider multiple locations and transboundary imaginations. So following in this transcultural approach, I study the donation's life story or its biography as it travels across varied locations to accrue new meanings and values. In other words, I propose looking beyond the Indian state or the donor or the giver's perspective towards those of the recipients, the community of recipients, the middlemen, the arbiters, and actually even the objects themselves. So really moving beyond the perspective of the giver or the donor. So first, let's turn our attention to the immediate recipient of this donation, namely Michael Sullivan, the University of Malaya Art Museum's first curator and lecturer in art history. He received the donation in 1959. Now, like his contemporaries elsewhere in a decolonizing world, Sullivan too moved away from art history's Eurocentric emphasis to reimagine the field with an Asian focus. He included Indian, Chinese, and Southeast Asian materials, both for collecting and for teaching purposes. As a result, when recontextualized in Sullivan's collection building and teaching activities, the 1959 donation ceased to represent India as a place or a race-based entity. Instead, the Indian donation is integrated in what was fast emerging as a new Asian art history. Next, and moving to the wider community of recipients, we ought to remember that the 1959 donation was received in a rousing atmosphere of nation building in Malaya, which means that throughout the decades of the 1950s and 60s, a new Malayan nation was being imagined and envisioned via various projects, whether via radio plays, art publications, or even museums, such as the University Museum that we're talking about. These projects remained alert to the imprint or the influences of Southeast Asian, Indian, and Chinese cultures in Malaya's long history. Therefore, Malaya, whether imagined as a nation, a history, or even an identity, emerged as a multiracial, multi-ethnic, and a multilingual entity, essentially a plural entity. The meaning of the 1959 donation, when received and recontextualized within this plural conception of Malayan, changed significantly. Once again, the donation ceased to represent India as a place or a race-based entity. Instead, it suggested a wider and a syncretic cultural system, which was characterized by intermixing. So continuing to build on this notion of intermixing and continuing to build on the transcultural approach, it becomes imperative to move beyond the donor and the recipient's perspectives to ask, what do these donated objects mean in and of themselves? What do they mean, whether individually and or collectively, right? Individually, these objects personify movement and intermixing of artistic styles, as also recognized back in its own day and as was acknowledged in the introductory essay or the catalogue. So for example, the donations catalogue quite clearly states that the prehistoric materials represent the Indus Valley civilization's connections as far as Mesopotamia. The examples of Buddhist art display mobility and integration of Greco-Roman, Mediterranean, and Indian conventions. And likewise, the Bombay-based modern artists M.F. Hussain and H.A. Gade negotiate European Cubism with indigenous conventions. So individually, these artworks ascertain constant mixing and mediation between Harappan and Mesopotamian or Parisian and Bombay-based studios and workshops. As a result, unlike the Indianization of Southeast Asia theory, the 1959 donations artifacts actually bear testimony to a very non-hierarchical and a collaborative relationship between cultures across the world. Through traces of the Greco-Roman or the Mediterranean worlds, these objects remind us that Indian culture is not bound to a fixed territory or civilization. And last, in trying to uncover diverse perspectives, we move towards a very crucial perspective, that of the key actor, the middleman, the fixer, or the arbiter of this donation. So, if you recall, in the introductory essay or the catalogue, the curator Michael Sullivan thanks the government of India alongside one Malcolm MacDonald. Now, MacDonald held an extremely unique and a joint appointment or a joint portfolio. So he was the Vice Chancellor of the University of Malaya, and simultaneously he was Britain's diplomat or High Commissioner to India. So he was based simultaneously between Malaya and New Delhi, which means that he was a member of the receiving party of the donation in 1959. But he was also as a New Delhi-based diplomat, he could also influence and shape this donation, or he could influence the donating party, as it were. Right. So in his memoirs, MacDonald claims to be the key arbiter of the 1959 donation. Throughout his long career as a diplomat, a Cold War diplomat in particular, and a university chancellor, MacDonald remained committed to building university collections across Asia. He wished to see the British Empire transform into a more equal Commonwealth. Yet again, from MacDonald's perspective, this donation was steered less with the intention of promoting India, or for that matter, any single nation state in a new regional order, as much as securing a culturally well-resourced bloc of decolonizing and Commonwealth states. So as I move towards concluding this particular case study, I do hope that by uncovering these diverse perspectives, that of the donors, the recipients, and the middlemen, the 1959 donation is appraised well beyond its obvious diplomatic and geopolitical connotations. For when read from the perspective of the donor or the Indian state, the 1959 donation asserts India's hegemony over Malaya. But when viewed through a non-hierarchical and a collaborative mode of decolonization, which considers all these diverse perspectives that go beyond the Indian state, it is fairly clear that the 1959 donation actually replays a long history of connections between India and Southeast Asia. Now, these connections, as we've seen, have been recalled time and again by individual curators, playwrights, and other actors in their own imagination of a Malayan nation. Similarly, every object in the donation, whether proto-historic, Buddhist, Islamic, or modern, signifies cultural intermixing. It urges us to look beyond geopolitical borders, to rethink our conceptions of nations, cultures, and even civilizations as being connected and unbounded by territorial limits. Furthermore, the donation's unusual facilitation by Malcolm MacDonald also reminds us to look for the friendly cross-border networks between diplomats, curators, and vice-chancellors. So perhaps, and in closing, it is a good idea to pause and gather the theoretical frameworks, the methodological tools and conceptual categories which are brought to bear on this particular study, and which, as I said, may have the potential to inform similar South-Southeast Asian exchanges of the mid-20th century. So while primarily this study adopts Arjun Appadurai's framework of the biography of objects, to remain attentive to the shifting contexts, uses, and interpretations of the 1959 donation, this approach reveals how the donation moves through different geographical, institutional, and ideological locations to accrue new meanings and values, which clearly go beyond an India-centered perspective. Next, the biography of the donation is situated within a Bandung-initiated spatio-temporal framework, which enables us to look beyond the conventional center-periphery, east-west, or even colonial national models, which almost always tend to characterize or inform most artistic and museum-based exchanges. In other words, the Bandung Conference offers us an alternative chronology and an alternative conception of globality. And this has been expanded by Christopher Lee in his study of Bandung. Since the conference is placed mid-century between the colonial and the post-colonial periods and the era of modern European imperialism and the Cold War, it clearly offers us an alternative timeline to understand new Afro-Asian or even intra-Asian partnerships, such as the one signified by India and Malaya. Furthermore, the conference offers an alternative conception of globality because it allows us to theorize relationships between very, very disparate and heterogeneous communities and actors, right? So to this end, Bandung is cast as an intersection of represented and imagined communities, and I'm happy to expand this in the Q&A. And finally, these Bandung-initiated solidarities are cast in longer histories of South-Southeast Asian connections and relationships. To this end, I adopt the tool of transculturation, which was first proposed within the field of Indian Ocean Studies and has since been mobilized very actively and effectively within global art histories. The reason why transculturation is so important to this study is because it does not represent a one-off mobility or a sort of one-time border crossing. Instead, it bears the potential to argue for repeated mobilities over extended periods of contact and relationships between cultures. And these extended periods of contact, by virtue of the sort of incessant going back and forth, right, whether of ships, people, goods, or ideas, that allows for mediation and translatability between cultures, instead of suggesting or instead of forging cultures into relationships which may be premised on very, very unequal terms, such as a wholesale transfer or borrowing or derivation. So, in closing, when viewed through the lens of transculturation, the 1959 donation is not the result of a one-off exchange, nor of a unidirectional flow from a dominant Indian civilization to a beneficiary or a weaker Southeast Asian culture. Instead, the 1959 donation becomes part of a long history of contacts and relationships, as was also recalled by various actors and curators in their own plural conception of a Malayan nation. In conclusion, the biography of the 1959 donation, when cast within a Bandung-initiated spatio-temporal framework, and when read through the prism of a global art history, cannot be treated exclusively from an Indian or a Malayan standpoint. On the contrary, these frameworks and tools encourage us to transcend the geopolitical logic of nation, culture, and civilization to appreciate artistic exchanges such as the 1959 donation as stemming from a shared and a connected imagination, one which is unbounded by territorial limits of the nation state. So I will end there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
I really want to thank Document Institute and Goethe Institute for this great support to bring us here to host this event here. And also I want to thank Yomi, our co-initiator of this project, and also many colleagues here, Haiyin, Marcos, Michael, Sophia, for their great organizational work. Today, I think I would like to present a new topic based on some old stuff, old materials I've already introduced in the previous workshops. Actually, the project title this project's overall title, Watch on a Promontory in German, Landzunge, comes from a study I conducted a few years ago. So that research somehow examined how socialist China, PRC engaged in artistic exchanges with the outside world after the 1949, and exploring the underlying context, strategies, and actual outcomes of these exchanges. So throughout the whole process, what's particularly struck me was that how China used artistic sensibility to somehow imagine the other during this period, from the 50s to the 80s. And also, more important, I think I realized that this imagination, contained a kind of significant elements of, self-projection and self-reference. But of course, I think today you already see that this Chinese mode of, self-projection has become kind of even more visible in this new political agenda globally. So on one hand, I think we see the official ideological output that threats culture and art as propaganda tools to reinforce a sort of nationalistic agenda. But more, I believe this self-projection served to also resolve many of the, inherent tensions and anxieties in that newly emerging socialist art of that period. So I think today I'm gonna want to share with you about artistic exchanges between China and Asia during 1949 to 1979. So I think, like we discussed, these exchanges carry that same quality of self-projection, and I'll share some of the specific examples in our previous workshops. But today I would like to dig a little bit deeper into what kinds of dialogues China's socialist art, let's set aside its role as a political propaganda for now. How what is this kind of dialogue China's socialist art with Asia actually established kind of a dialogue here. So, and were these dialogues, fully developed or underdeveloped? And if not, what were the limiting factors, in this exchange? So I think obviously this question connects not just China, not just to China's internal circumstances, political circumstances, but also to the broader socialist bloc in Asia and leftist movements across the region. Okay, for China and Asia, navigating the geopolitical complexities. So when discussing China and Asia relations, we must, first acknowledge that how geopolitics shaped everything here. Before 1956, China-Soviet ties were very strong, and Beijing's Asia policy somehow largely followed Moscow's lead. But on the Soviet side, their Asian political agenda, especially post-war decolonization efforts, actually continues their pre-war patterns. So here's the twist. I think the Soviets made the anti-fascist Popular Front their major ideological centerpiece. And this means allying with major imperial powers like Britain, like France, against Germany. So for Asia's decolonization movements and agenda, this ironically somehow deepened Soviet ties with the former colonizers, undermining a sort of anti-colonial work. I think only after Joseph Stalin's death did Moscow launch a new decolonization initiatives, like the Afro-Asian Film Festival and the Afro-Asian Writers Conference we talked about yesterday, the Bandung Conference particularly actually surprised the Soviets, so forcing them to somehow recalibrate their Asia policy. So China's relation with Asia before the mid of 1950s were heavily shaped by Soviet influence. So China's participation in the Bandung Conference actually marks the country's first real step away from Moscow's Asian policy. Though, back home in China, the government certainly somehow exaggerated China's role at the Bandung Conference. Throughout China's political landscape from the 1950s to the 1970s, the dominant narratives were anti-imperialism, anti-feudalism, and later anti-imperialism, anti-revisionism, targeting the Soviets. So yet Asia's crucial post-power decolonization agenda occupies a kind of a more peripheral, almost invisible space in China's priorities, political priorities. So I think today many of my colleagues, researchers are, both inside, within and outside China, they are rediscovering this dimension, somehow, piecing together, historical traces. But, from this available evidence, these scholars are reconstructing these fragments, but we still have to acknowledge that they only partially demonstrate China's attempt to build a deeper Asian partnerships. So these ties ultimately provide fragile and shifting global geopolitics. For example, China actually was the founding member of the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organization, known as AAPSO, which is an international body established after the Bandung Conference that held its first meeting in Cairo in 1957. And China officially withdrew from this organization in 1967. So during this decade, from 57 to 67 of participation, China also attended, like 4 times this Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference. It was also precisely in these years, in these 10 years, that China began articulating its clear anti-imperialist and anti-revisionalist political stance, attempting to position itself with Asia's decolonization process through this dual opposition. Of course, I think the deterioration of Sino-Soviet relations served here as a key political factor during China's involvement. This is the picture I actually quoted from Rosen Jagalov's new book that demonstrates, Mao Dun and Zhou Yang, Minister and Vice Minister of Culture, participating in the Afro-Asian Writers Conference in Tashkent. And also, I can give you 2 more geopolitical examples. As we know, China and India, for example, had a major border conflicts in the 1960s, right? But what's often overlooked is that before the 1959, before the Tibetan uprising and the rapid deterioration of Sino-Indian relations, the 2 countries, India and China, actually enjoyed nearly a decade of very close ties. In 1954, Nehru visited China, where he was kind of warmly welcomed in Beijing. And Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao himself, praised Nehru's leadership in India's national independence movement. In the same year, Zhou Enlai, the Prime Minister of China, became the first Chinese premier to visit a non-socialist country when he traveled to India. And India also played a key role in supporting China's participation in the Bandung Conference in 1955. And in the art world, this friendship, also left its mark. In 1955, Beijing hosted an exhibition commemorating the 1,500-year legacy of India Ajanta murals. So the show wasn't just a diplomatic gesture. It was also an attempt somehow to frame China and India as a civilizational partners shaping Asia's future. Of course, and then one thing after another, with the border war, this potential Sino-Indian-led vision of Asia came to an end. Another example is China and Indonesia. As you know, former Indonesian President Sukarno, he visited China in 1956. And the Chinese government also attached a great importance to this visit because for China, this was a crucial opportunity to build kind of friendships with the third world nations. Meanwhile, I think also in the same year, they also saw the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, where Stalin's political legacy was openly criticized and denounced. And this had a very profound impact on China, promoting serious reflections about, pursuing a more independent path. So engaging with Sukarno offered China kind of valuable experience in this regard. And the Chinese government, as you see, has produced a catalog of paintings. It's something I already introduced, and many of you may know very well. I just will get it through very quickly. A catalog of paintings from Sukarno's collection, give it to him as a gift. So the catalog is available in Indonesian, English, and Chinese. So let's take a very quick look of what is involved, what kind of works were involved in this catalog. There are, 206 works from more than 70 artists from various countries, and works by local Indonesian artists make up the majority, and mostly created in the period after Indonesian independence. And these works will range from, mythological and religious themes to landscapes to realism, but also we also see some works with kind of exotic gaze, such as those from some Dutch artists. Very quickly, yeah. And also, I think these are also several works from China gifts given to Sukarno during this his visit in Beijing by some of the artists who were highly praised by the Chinese officials. So except for the works of Li Manfeng, Li Manfeng's work is, I think it's this one, or I forgot. Anyway, Indonesian Chinese painter, and these Chinese works are all ink paintings. And this was at the time, worth to mention, it was at the time when the Chinese art world was somehow undergoing a reform of ink painting with some official demands to incorporate the techniques and spirit of socialist realism into the ink painting. Not this one, but next one you will see. This is Li Manfeng's work, I'm sorry. Yeah, this one you will see. Yeah. So this is one of these paintings. It's created by the artist Zhang Xuefu in 54, entitled Changing Flooding into Water Conservation. And it was shown at the second National Art Exhibition and was presented to Sukarno as a gift. And Zhang Xuefu later also repainted this work with the same title based on the original. And was also made into a single painting for public scale, to publicize the achievements of industrial construction in New China. Clearly, this process of circulation of the work somehow lends it a legitimacy and historical status. And the painting itself employs some of the experiments of new ink painting, such as the use of the ink and watercolor techniques, to somehow portray these industrial construction scenes. In other words, the work combines the techniques of former literati painting with the new content of the new zeitgeist. So also, I think interesting to mention that in circulation, right, in the field of circulation, in addition to the above, Zhang Xuefu's work on the same subject appears also in the Science Pictorial, which is one of the most important government-run science-themed publication in China at that time, and was primarily responsible for comprehensive popularization of science. So this publication was very influential both in the scientific community and in the field of popular culture. And in the January 1958 issue, this issue, an illustration titled "Save and Improve the Continuous Arch Dam" appeared on the most prominent color page of the magazine. And the illustration was designed by scientist Rui Lin and also drawn by the same artist, Zhang Xuefu. So I don't want to continue here because I think it somehow also reflects on, what kind of role the arts plays, in exchange or in dialogue with the other Asian regions, and what kind of things that can go beyond, socialist realism, embedded in these kind of creations, and how do we redefine this kind of practice here? For example, how art and science, get into dialogue at that time, under the socialist umbrella, and how this very popular, issue, art and technology and science, can be discussed at that time, and how something was still remain undiscovered. So I don't want to continue here. Then I came to my second point, how China's constructed and deconstructed cultural dialogues with Asia at the institutional level. I'll just give you a very roughly summarized formula that somehow give you the key similarity and difference in the art systems and artistic concepts of socialist countries in Asia, for those who are not so familiar with this system. I think first of all, in terms of a mechanism, the entire post-1949 production of fine art in China was actually carried out within a highly unified system, like the other socialist countries in Asia. So in this system, a cultural department designated by the central government was responsible for managing different fields of art, including conception, production, propaganda, and education of art, fine art, with the Ministry of Culture, the Ministry of Propaganda, and the Ministry of Education being the main functionaries within this. Meanwhile, inheriting the Soviet system of fine art, like you can see here, China established the Artists Association in 1950, a non-governmental organization that was in fact a unified association of cultural bureaucrats officially appointed by the Chinese government, or who enjoyed significant positions in the art world. So with branches in every province and city, this association was thus managed from top to bottom, from the center to the local level, and becomes kind of essentially the highest authority in the field of art in China. So in terms of artist dialogue with Asia, I think as part of the propaganda program of the New China, art somehow, this dialogue with Asia of art carries a first and foremost a political mandate, so which was developed and promoted by different institutions in the art system. So on the factual level, the first was the introduction of exhibitions in which art from the socialist bloc and the few that were considered as considered progressive and revolutionary was shown in the major cities of Beijing, Shanghai, Hangzhou, and so on, and which encompassed the dimensions of realist art, folk art, expressionist art. And the second was through the sending of students to the Soviet Union, to East European countries to study there, right? And introducing artists from these places to China, such as there's two famous painter corps at that time. One of this is called Maximov Painter Corps, led by a established realist artist Maximov, and the Eugen Popa painting course at the early of the 1960s, led by a Romanian-based artist called Eugen Popa. So in terms of mechanism, for example, on October the 2nd, 1949, the day after the founding of New China, the Chinese government held the Chinese Congress of the Defense of World Peace in Beijing. This is a little complicated history. This Congress was convened in order to attend the World Peace Conference at the World Peace Council, a socialist organization established in 1950, as well as to participate in the Asia-Pacific Peace Conference, and to be sent to Germany and Austria to participate in the anti-fascist exhibition and the International Science Committees. It's a long history. I think I'm going to skip this. So I think as a meeting in Vienna in 1951, the World Peace Council decided to organize annually, among the different countries that had joined the council, a number of activities to commemorate cultural figures from various countries. People like Qi Baishi, the famous Chinese ink painter, or Velázquez from Spain, Rembrandt, Da Vinci, the Japanese painters like Katsushika, Hokusai, and Sensu, among many others. And on the level of the government institutions, this is actually shown here. The Committee for Cultural Relation and with foreign countries established in 1958, and it is the specialized body that manages Chinese foreign cultural exports and cultural imports. There are also many other, associations and organizations that you can have a look at. Among them, I think most of the important ones are the Sino-Soviet Friendship Association and China-Africa Friendship Association. Yeah. So there are also many, international festivals like the Afro-Asia Film Festival that should also be mentioned here. So I think one thing that we haven't mentioned yet in this symposium is the World Festival of Youth and Students, where you can see one of the Chinese artists, Zhou Changgu's work was shown there, which was initiated by the World League for Democracy in 1947 at the Paris Council, and with the participation of mostly socialist countries. What else? I think I'm gonna skip something because I don't think I have enough time to say everything. Yeah, there's another important festival, I think, in the very famous Leipzig Book Fair. Although China participated only once, but Wu Fan and Li Pingfang actually of this Solidarity painting won some prize there. And then I'm gonna come to my third point, constructing and deconstructing the idea of Asia. So the title of our workshop on the promontory in German Landzunge comes from a long poem by the Chinese poet Ai Qing, who is actually Ai Weiwei's father, on the Chilean promontory completed in 1956. And in this poem, Ai Qing somehow recalls his visit to the poet Pablo Neruda in Chile in 1954. So the poem, among other things, presents kind of a subject's self-projection and imagination of the other in this kind of a cross-regional exchange of art from China to other countries, other regions. Because Neruda visited China in 1928, and his friendship with Ai Qing and others began at that time. So as kind of a left-wing activist, Neruda passionately advocated for the socialist revolutions in Cuba and China. And in 1951, he returned to China, observing that the oldest culture, I quote, the oldest culture in the world is changing in a vast land. Ai Qing's return visit was prompted by an invitation from Neruda on his 50th birthday, and he wrote this poem, which is kind of a tribute to the friendship between the two poets, but also somehow shows a certain sincere left-wing internationalist sentiment, on which the main part of the poem is placed. So I love this promontory, and I love my hometown is the last two lines of this poem. So I think in the case of mainland China during the 1950s, its engagement with the socialist bloc and the third world countries was largely influenced by its quest to assert national subjectivity as reflected in this poem. So intertwined with the various social mobilizations underpinning this assertion. So this interaction was often self-serving, like I said, primarily focused on disseminating Mao Zedong's political ideology and the communist ethos globally. Art served here as a tool for exporting China's methodologies and ideologies to its allied nations, including the Asian countries. So I think I still have 2 minutes. Another dimension was China's ideological and artistic construction of kind of a center-periphery hierarchy, which I introduced in Manila, actually, in our workshop, that profoundly shaped its Asian relations. And in this framework, especially after the Sino-Soviet split, China positioned itself as the epicenter of world revolution. So when I talk about this China-Asia dialogue, between the central government and the border regions, for example, such as Tibet, Xinjiang, home to the Uyghur people, I think something interesting just comes up here. So in the 50s and 60s, China was constantly tweaking its ethnic policies to balance relationships between the center and these regions, the border regions, which actually affect China's Asian policy in a way. For example, China's foreign policy with India. So starting in 1951, big central art institutions like the China Art Association and the Central Academy of Fine Arts, they began to organize massive expeditions and art trips to the borderlands and Northwest, such as Tibet and Xinjiang. Especially after Tibet's liberation in 1951, up through the democratic reforms in 1959, artists were basically deployed by the central government and these institutions to the Tibetan plateau. And their artwork focused on stuff like promoting national unity, celebrating the opening of the Qinghai-Tibet Highway, showing off construction projects, and highlighting the reforms after the 1959 uprising. Artists were even trying to create kind of uniquely Chinese style of oil painting using Tibetan themes. I think here's the kicker, right? This whole exchange wasn't just one way. There were also a kind of a side projection and going on. So for example, Chinese Art Association top art schools from Beijing and Shanghai and Hangzhou would send artists to these regions to teach realistic painting techniques, and spread some kind of creative guidelines that was super political, like how to make art that aligns with the party's vision. Although here things somehow, borderland themes are kind of special in socialist art. I think they gave us this unique lens to see how the us and them, or the center and the periphery, interacted back in the socialist era. And part of this probably because, military pressure, forcing things into line, right? But it also makes you wonder, maybe ethnic themes in this cross-regional exchanges, in this kind of hierarchy of center and periphery exchange, actually somehow challenged the rules of socialist art. It's like, maybe they push people to dig deeper into how aesthetics and propaganda can mix or clash. It is like the borderlands that become this unexpected lab for experimenting with ideas that center couldn't even touch. So this is what is also to say that it embodies some kind of a strong projection, self-referential character of Chinese socialist art in this kind of exchanges, a character that we can still feel even today. So a two-sidedness, a strong sense of shaping subjectivity on the one hand, and a hegemonic closure on the other, has also become a legacy that today's researchers have difficulties to deal with. And this also brings us to the topic of solidarity, I think, which we often refer to in the framework of the Global South. So during Maoist era, during socialist era, China faced the world of Asia with a simple kind of internationalist mentality and sustained a policy of economic and cultural assistance to some Asian countries, but also particularly in Africa. It can be even said that the solidarity was the most appealing part of Maoism and one of the main reasons for its popularity in the world outside of China after 1968. However, due to the particular domestic political context, this internationalist Asian solidarity, Chinese edition, is often not manifested on a practical level, but has a strongly imaginative character And it is in this imagined solidarity that the arts have much to offer. I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for your presentations. I must admit, there were so many things going through my head. I had a difficult time piecing together all of your presentations, but just to flesh out some of the few keywords or a few things that came up to me into my mind were, this both Michelle and Priya, you do a deep dive into some visual, and also Sue, visual analysis or analysis of visual representations that were very much about illustrating different ways of belonging, either to a nation, to an ethnic group, or to just long-running civilizations, and also to an international art world. And in a way, these artworks or objects become contested sites where you negotiate different types or different ways of belonging to these groups and this moment of solidarity. And another thing was the movement of objects, how, and also the flow of ideas and ideologies and diplomatic ties that were very much the point of discussion for you, Priya, and also Sue, and how you both try and think about whether they can be seen as these sort of notions of multiplicity or plurality, rather than seeing diplomatic friendships as a one way of flow or imposing a certain ideology or power onto another, but whether we can kind of move away from that dynamics and think differently. Third one was the role of institutions and how many entities that are related to these institutions at various levels in a way try to exercise their own agencies back then also and today. And it would be great to sort of talk more about these as we go on with this conversation. But all of you also leave your presentation with some very thought-provoking and big questions. And I thought it would be nice to revisit those questions that you end your presentations with. So Michelle, in accounting for how ink art sort of emerged as this new category for thinking about Cold War and its legacies today, you posed this question, can ink art account for not only for the cosmopolitanism of the artist and the multiplicity, but also oppose new radical thinking? And I was wondering whether if you could talk a bit more about this question that you sort of left your presentation with.
I don't really have an answer for that, but I think that question comes from looking at these works for a number of years now and then realizing that maybe they are actually very conservative, or the issue of politics was not a question of focus for some of these artists. And I think then that sort of doesn't square for me in one way or another. Perhaps it's also inflected by, what has been happening in my hometown is that, art would be great if it does more. But I think there is that question that's lingering. And I think some of that is also coming from how most of these artists that are written in art history as such come from an elite, social and intellectual elite class background. And the artists who I worked on for my dissertation and before that at Asia Art Archive is an immigrant working class artist. And sort of confronting these sort of different biographies and therefore their lack of writing or undeclared or unclear positions in certain art history writing, in either places I can't really locate radical thinking, or the way that radical thinking has sort of presented itself in the studies that are existing, I can't find articulations for that. And I think it's a very initial stage of
what were these artists thinking beyond survival, or was political ideals or an imagination of a different world where the conditions that you're located at, say in Hong Kong, where you're a British colony until relatively recently, and most of these people were had fled China or had left China for various reasons. Could there be a space, or are there articulations of any imagination of a different world in a condition like that? That's not as straightforward as, say, if you are, a non-aligned nation and, nationhood continues to not be viable for a territory like Hong Kong. So if a place's sort of conditions of history writing and art history writing is like that, what can the artworks tell? Like, this is sort of something that I continue to grapple with and has sort of become increasingly important since 2019.
Thank you. And moving on to Priya with sort of your question or proposal to kind of adopt or apply this idea of transcultural approach to think about this 1959 donation from India to Malaya to account for sort of this multiplicity of perspectives, and you take us through this different entities or players involved in this process of sort of gifting or donating artifacts. And I was wondering whether you could talk more about this possibility of applying transcultural methodology to your case study. And because I'm coming from this idea where you go through different perspectives and outlines their each different interpretations of what this donation could mean. But I was wondering whether we could also look into the structures that mobilize this movement and whether you could talk a bit more about it in relation to that as well.
Yeah, so I'll speak to the point of transculturation first. I think what it allows us to do is to look at a longer history of mobilities, right? And, if I can use an example from yesterday's exercise when we worked with the timeline, and so where you raised this question about Pan-Asianism. So it's one thing to look at Pan-Asianism in terms of, post-1950s, right? But then we did arrive at that moment where we said that there's a longer history to Pan-Asianism, which goes back to the early 1900s and to Tagore and Okakura. So I think I'm trying to work with a similar framework where you do not look at these artistic exchanges as products of, a decolonizing culture or Cold War or non-aligned movements, but can we sort of resituate them in a longer history of exchange and mobility? And as I mentioned, transculturation does emphasize that we don't read these activities as one-off border crossings or exchanges, right? But that they belong to a repeated sort of mobility and exchange, and which can go back to many millennia, for as long as ships would have sailed between these different regions. So I think that is the contribution of transculturation, that we situate all this in a longer history. And sorry, your second question was to do with the institutional structures.
Yes, or the Cold War structures, because you account for different perspectives.
Yeah.
But whether we could think more on a structural level that prompt or facilitate the kind of movements that you were talking about through your case study.
So are you referring to institutional structures in particular? That might be one.
Yes,
way.
that could be one.
Yeah. So, in the interest of time, I did sort of flatten and reduce the Indian perspective in today's presentation as being one unified state-backed perspective, right? Which is not the case. Because again, within the Indian perspective, there are lots of variations. And I actually want to refer back to Koichiro's point that was raised yesterday. So you spoke about a sort of grassroots level curatorial autonomy and an institutional curatorial trajectory or a state scripted trajectory, right? There's a similar thing going on the India side, So it depends how we define the institutional perspective. I mean, yes, there is the state which wants to promote India's civilizational superiority or, hegemony, political hegemony even over Southeast Asian nation states. But that's not necessarily what curatorial institutions and curatorial agents on the ground desire, right? And so I couldn't go into this, but if you really look at the selection of the 55 objects, they actually do not support that Indianization of Southeast Asia, because that theory is focused on the first millennium, and it tends to exclude Islamic networks and so on and so forth, right? And as curators and art historians, we know that we need to remain alert as much to the absences as to the inclusions, right? So the curatorial agents on the ground actually really end up exercising their agency. And they're trying to correct or rectify these imbalances in Southeast Asian relations. So the selection of objects actually does not support or does not play into that the Indianization of Southeast Asia, right? It's trying to propose a more equitable relationship. So at the structural level, even on the India side, there are differences. It's sort of, the views are quite different and heterogeneous, and they collide. And then again, in terms of the structures on the Malayan side, I think there are different ways to receive and to reread this donation, right? So that in terms of the collection building and teaching activities that are going on in Malaya, this donation is actually very welcome. So it's not as if people are resisting this as an Indian move or a proposition of Indian hegemony. This is very welcome to be able to complete that whole arc of Indian, Chinese, and Southeast Asian objects in the teaching collection of the university, right? And then, yeah, so I think that's the kind of institutional reading, but that too changes over time. So this was the reading back then in the 1950s and 60s. And today, actually, this donation, or parts of this donation, continue to hang in the university museum. And we carry on teaching with this collection. So we're again sort of bringing new meanings and interpretations to the same objects. I don't know if that answers your question fully.
Yes, it does. And I think it's helpful for us to think about not in terms of ruptures, as you've suggested, but in terms of this longer trajectory of continuing histories and sort of legacies having continued impact on the present and the contemporary times. And this is something that Michelle, you highlight in your presentation, mostly how this sort of Cold War conditions actually are being revisited and recontextualized by the curators today. And before we move on to Sway, maybe I thought if we could ask you, Michelle, to talk a bit more about how you saw this sort of revisiting the 1968 exhibition, and now sort of through the frame or the curatorial lens of Leslie Mao's exhibitions and other ink art exhibitions that have opened up in the past few years. Like, do you see continuities and also differences in how this ink art is being framed and the way these artists were dealing with abstraction and modernism, and also their sort of past and lineage with China's civilization?
Thank you for the question. I think maybe the show at M+ can be unpacked a little more. It's called A Weight of Lightness, Potential of Ink Art, something like that. But then the differences with, say, the 1968 show is that it has definitely expanded in terms of the geographical areas that were covered. So there are Iranian artists. Glenn Lai was in it, so there's an expansion of geography as well as a medium. The sort of main through line of it, it's still abstraction as one way or another of relating to the different traditions of the different places. And so ink art then becomes very attitude-based, and it is very fluid. And formally, it is also very interesting. But I think one of the actually Leslie showed in the M Plus Pavilion, so outline all of that quite clearly. And actually the list of works are online, so you can actually still see how the different juxtapositions are created. That when it got to the M Plus Museum, when it opened with their first exhibition, I'm blanking on the name right now. It's something about, I really don't remember, but it is, I call it the Ink Gallery, or I call it the Leslie Gallery, which really then focuses on abstraction, and Krishna Reddy gets featured there. Then maybe because of the museum's sort of now open to the public, there's a much more focus on the formal gestures and the context of these different practices, and their own relationship to the tradition sort of receded. And it sort of leaves you wanting more context. But I can see why for a more an audience that may find that much art historical context intimidating, the focus on the formal sort of serves as a good entry point. And then the Cold War context then becomes even 2 steps further away. So it almost goes back to the viewer exercising your own sort of agency to go say, oh, how much of the context and the formal decisions do I sort of read into? As someone who's been in the field for a number of years, that's incredibly interesting for me. But I'm not entirely always sure if that's interesting for other audiences. Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. Sue, so the last part, sort of the concluding part of your presentation, so you mentioned how China's international solidarity could not really be manifested on a practical level, but had to be sort of remained on an imagination or imaginative level. I was wondering whether you could unpack this a little more, what you meant by this, and because it also, this idea of unimagining is the sort of the main focus of your research as well. And this methodology or this practice of unimagining, how we could think about it in relation to your work.
Anything actually? Okay, thank you for the question. I think it's twofold. One thing is really this China's edition of solidarity, in dialogue with Asian regions, with third world countries, but you cannot really label it as some kind of a mobility per se. It's more like a limited mobility, and then it can be only bridged, but not really rediscovered somehow, right? You can only bridge somehow through some sort of imagination, right? So from to this perspective, as like let's say as a contemporary art practitioner, right? So going back to this history of solidarity of China with Asia, it is kind of a risky move, I have to say, because on the one hand, all your research is actually based on fragments, historical fragments, very invisible trajectories that you have to find out, and you will find out, and material that may not be of any relevance actually. So this, as I said, this Asian project in China, or agenda in China for the Chinese government, but also for the art world, because they are somehow, of course, closely connected, are kind of something that is only secondary in the whole country's national project. So I think as a researcher, somehow, if you really want to recontextualize this thing, this history, you may need to somehow to think about if you want to which direction you want to go, right? Is this non-factual research, or is this only factual-based, fact-based research? So for me, it's more like a practice, actually. You find a balance between these two. So it's a kind of a, I don't know, a practice of imagination, practice, and research, actually. So this is one thing. The other thing is also that there's also a risk there, because I think that you take a step into that, what I just described, that could be sometimes, parallel to China's current political or diplomatic project, propaganda project, right? So sometimes I don't know what kind of a political stance you have to hold. This is another thing, but still, I mean, you really have to somehow to think about yourself positioning in this practice. So this is my answer. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yes. So I think now we will open the questions to the floor. Does anyone else have questions? Yes.
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank all of the presenters. I think thank you, Sue, Michelle, and Priya. I find your presentation very inspiring and it's very touching for me. And I think they also create a very beautiful dialogue between within this panel. And I think I have a small two questions out of my curiosity to Michelle and Priya. So for Michelle's presentation, I think actually I was very touched by your presentation because it echoes a lot with my own research, and which I will also present tomorrow in the workshop. And then I was just curious that out of your throughout your research, did you sense that the artists from different part of the Chinese-speaking region, how they reflect differently or similarly to the Chinese heritage that you said, like their Chinese heritage or the Chinese history? And perhaps you also sense different or changing attitude or positions along their exchanging processes within the Asian communities or without and beyond the Asian communities, how their attitudes toward this, like the Chinese heritage, or how they merge the abstraction attitude towards into their paintings or artworks. Does it change, or does it have a different positions throughout the process of this kind of exchange? So another small questions to Priya is regarding the object, the transcultural perspective on the level of objects itself. So you have different aspects, right? And I'm really specifically interested in the objects level. So my question is that, do you think that by analyzing from the object's point of view alone and gender the meanings for itself, for the object itself on its life history, or you think it should be looked within different aspects that you highlighted? Yeah, so thank you.
The short answer is yes. But I think it's also that itself is complicated, I think. And throughout my research, I think and I still am working through this because it takes you beyond ink paintings. It actually goes back to what are the lived realities of these artists? What are the conditions that they were born with? What were the conditions that they made? How did things beyond their control changed, right? And how did they decide to give form or not give form to some of these experiences? I think in the case of Malaya and Malaysia and Singapore eventually, or at least that's also through the framing of the national collection, that there is that sort of application of the language of ink to the subject matter of the state or the Southeast Asian region or all of that. In Hong Kong, a lot of that is much more formal. The Chinese heritage becomes much more of an idea that needs to be sort of modernized or renewed through the medium of ink or the language of ink, which is attractive to the British colonial government. How do you divorce individual desires from that is another question. But what I'm interested in, and I think this will be quite interesting, is it goes back to their lived realities. Like they made work, they presented themselves as artists, but they also lived as people. And I think that, for me, is where the potential is, like that they travel, right? The 10-man group traveled, Hong Kong artists traveled. And it is, I think, in those sort of almost trivial and sort of personal, transient and social moments that I like to think that that's where some of the interesting narratives can sort of come through. And of course, it's art historically as a methodology also trying to challenge that focus on the works that survive, works that are read as works. So yes, and there's more.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think I'm working with both methods, which is to do a sort of formal and stylistic analysis of each individual object, which of course is central to art history or to an art historical approach. And so I'm reading these objects. I use the term intermixing, right? To highlight the sort of coming together of these different stylistic and technical strains, whether it's Greco-Roman, Mediterranean, European Cubism. So I'm using the term intermixing, whereas I think Michel uses cosmopolitanism. But I think what we both are suggesting that these objects produced at different points in time do not reject the other, whether stylistically or technically. So rejection of the other was strongly promoted by Cold War and colonial binaries. That's not what is happening in our respective case studies. So that's the first method, call it visual, formal, or stylistic analysis, which is the bedrock of art history. But what I'm also suggesting is that it's important that we don't limit our analysis of these objects to production, which is what older art histories tended to do, to limit our view to the production end of the spectrum and to not quite take into consideration the reception of these objects. So I think I'm trying to sort of encourage that view, which comes through Appadurai's, whether biography of objects or social life of things, to basically uncover what happens to these objects when they travel across these different locations, whether institutional or pedagogical or museological. So it really is a combination of both the methods. And then also actually the third, which I couldn't cover, which is reading the objects in relation to the others. So to look at the sort of inclusions and omissions that happen, that too. I hope that answers your question.
Well, thank you for the interventions. I think we learned a lot about roles and policies of China and India, particularly. And Priya, you mentioned what the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru perceived as the role of India as the mother culture, which I find is a very strong expression of superiority. And I asked myself, how would that be compatible at all with the spirit of the Bandung conference? And was that self-perception of India's role be kind of discontinued formally, or when did it disappear, and how would that fit together? Thanks a lot.
Thanks for that question. So these two views, right? The self-perception of India as being superior civilizationally and culturally, and then the proposition of solidarity and a united stance at Bandung did not sit well together. And this actually brings us back to Arlette's presentation from yesterday, that yes, Bandung and these Afro-Asian engagements and gatherings did present the opportunity to negotiate differences and to come together, but they were not without these sorts of neo-imperialist tendencies, which I think even Merv raised in his presentation, right? I know it's a strong expression that India becomes the fountainhead or the mother culture, but this view was being promoted very, very strongly in sort of strong nationalistic terms by the Greater India Society located in Kolkata. And it had a flagship journal, the Greater India Journal, which became the sort of mouthpiece of this view. Now, I must here say that there were different gradations of this view, right? So that there are some writers and scholars who take a very extreme view of India's superiority over Southeast Asian cultures. And there are others, such as Ananda Kumaraswamy, who take a more measured and calibrated view, where once in a while they do acknowledge the local agencies of Southeast Asian nation states, right? So this is the different gradations. So I'm not suggesting that Nehru belonged to this kind of shrill extreme end of the spectrum, but the fact that he did subscribe to this view comes through in his writings, The Discovery of India, which was written in prison. Now, I haven't studied Nehru's writings to see then whether he himself stops subscribing to this view. I don't know. But my quick response, he did upset people at Bandung, right? So there are these sorts of, whether you call it neo-imperialist or hegemonic propositions that are going on, despite what seems to be a very happy and equitable relationship between Afro-Asian countries. That's not quite the case. So he did upset people.
We have question at the back.
Yeah, thank you very much for this three amazing presentations. And I think I have to apologize that my question goes as well to you, Priya, because I was very amazed by your presentation. Just with two remarks. One is this concept of Southeast Asia, which I think only came up in Second World War, actually, by the Allied forces attacking Japan. So this was a very new perspective, right, of this region. And if you speak about the mother culture of India, then I wonder, so who were the kids, right? So was that already all over Southeast Asia because this concept was very new? Or was it much more directed to Malaya for, I mean, because there are arguments maybe that Malaya and Indonesia, you know, could be part of this much more than, for example, other countries in Southeast Asia. And there would be as well arguments to propose Taiwan as kind of a mother culture, you know, by the indigenous people from Taiwan, but that's a different story. So that would be one question. And the other is that I'm still a bit, even in this framework of I think 2 years before only Malaya became independent. So the Commonwealth obviously was still very strong. And you mentioned the High Commissioner, MacDonald, and I think there was another High Commissioner in Malaya, I forgot the name. Anyway, so these people seem to be very, very in this discourse as well, and in this exchange, and there were even art collectives. I think MacDonald was even collecting art. So maybe from the perspective of the Commonwealth, this exchange made a lot of sense, right? To strategically, I don't know if it's me. Anyway, maybe I just finish and I just leave it to you. Thank you.
So to your first question, who were the kids of the mother culture, and was it just Malaya? No, the sort of children born out of the mother culture are spread across Southeast Asia, and different scholars are researching different sorts of things, right? But you know, to go back to the roots of this theory of Greater India or the Indianization of Southeast Asia, it actually started out with the French and Dutch epigraphists and numismatics who were really, you know, studying these materials and sort of linking them back to an Indian origin culture. But to your question, depending on what area or region within Southeast Asia they are studying, they're all tracing back the influence to a so-called point of origin, which is India. So really, the children or the offsprings of this theory are spread out across Southeast Asia, right? I forgot to sort of answer that is there a formal end or conclusion to this Indianization theory? Well, that flagship journal of the Southeast Asia Society dissolves exactly in 1959. Because the 50s and 60s, you have a lot of writing and curators exercising their agency to correct this relationship. They're trying to find ways to correct this, right? So we don't know, I mean, I don't know, I haven't researched enough to find out whether the journal shuts down because of financial problems or other sorts of issues, or is it because there's a real pushback against this whole theory of Greater India? To your second question, you spoke about Malcolm MacDonald and the other diplomats being collectors. So are you sort of asking if that played into their, their aspirations to have a more equal Commonwealth? Yes. So Malcolm MacDonald built a very large collection throughout his Cold War, his career as a Cold War diplomat. And he actually collected in different locations, including Africa and Asia. Now, what I think is very different from the sort of colonial models of collecting is that he was out there in the field, meeting with artists, visiting artist studios, getting to know them. And the Bombay-based progressive artists whose paintings come through in the 1959 donation most likely were a result of his personal friendship with Hussein and other Bombay-based artists. Also, his sort of intention to donate to these various university museums was a very genuine one, because he donates, I mean, he doesn't just steer donations that come through the government of India, but he actually gives away large parts of his personal collection to different institutions in Malaya, as far as Durham, I think even China, Brunei. So he's really going around making personal donations as well. And in his memoirs and sort of other correspondence, he is very committed to this idea that these institutions should be well resourced. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think, we're running out of time. So we'll end our conversation here. Thank you again for your wonderful presentations.